Hello, I'm Sebastian Crane. I've been a ghost tour guide here in Salem, Massachusetts for 3 years. And today I am so thrilled to get to chat about some of Salem's most harrowing hauntings and a bit of my experiences doing the work that I do. Thank you so much for hosting me. We have a solid hour, and I'm going to start by briefly covering some history, and then I'll dig into the ghost stories. Then I will tell you something personal about being a ghost tour guide that I never really get to tell anyone. And I'm actually going to leave a good chunk of time at the end to take your questions because I really want to tailor this to what you are all curious about. A straight lecture isn't really my style, especially because I'm not necessarily an academic. If you don't end up having any questions, that's okay too. I can work through a list of things most frequently asked on my tours if we end up having some time to kill. But I would like to open with a quote from one of my all-time favorite books. It's called Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places by Colin Dickey. I received this as a gift from somebody very dear to me 2 years ago, and it put into words what I had been realizing after telling ghost stories night after night after night. And I'm going to quote this book a few times as I chat, but I would like to start with this one. In a world where nearly every moment of our lives is photographed, recorded, and documented, the gaps in the past still beckon us. Searching for ghosts can be an attempt to reconstruct what is lost. By sifting through time for stories that have been misplaced or forgotten, we listen to the voices that call out to be remembered. Our ghost stories center on unfinished endings, broken relationships, things left unexplained. They offer an alternative kind of history, foregrounding what might otherwise be ignored. Ghost stories are a way of talking about things we're not otherwise allowed to discuss, a forbidden history we thought bricked up safely in the walls. Our country's ghost stories are themselves the dreams or nightmares of a nation, the Freudian slips of whole communities, uncomfortable and unbidden expressions of things we'd assumed were long past and no longer important. If American history is taught to school children as a series of great striding benchmarks, the history of America's ghost stories is one of crimes left unsolved or transgressions we now feel guilty about. They offer explanations for the seemingly inexplicable, address injustices after the fact, or give expression to our unsated and unstated desires and fears. So, Salem is a deeply haunted city. It is like haunted to its core. Just about every clerk or like shopkeeper you talk to has a story about something in the basement. I've definitely overheard people at bars chatting about the roulette that is trying to rent in the historic district because it's like every other house seems to have some kind of poltergeist. Apparently, every restaurant, every hotel has a ghost story. We are drowning in them. My route focuses on the 6 historic sites downtown with the most consistently reported paranormal activity. And if we're talking about the most famous hauntings here in the city, we have got to talk about the history here. My tours usually end up being 2 parts history, 1 part ghost story, because Salem is famous for a little something called the witch trials of 1692. Yes, this is what draws a lot of people here. And unsurprisingly, most of the spirits allegedly lingering with us, they are puritanical ones who are very angry about their unfinished business in the late 1600s. The story is, of course, infamous. It begins in the hopeless dark of February of 1692 in the silence of Reverend Paris's unfriendly little house. That winter had been the coldest to date, and the Reverend's family would have been stiff and aching from the cold that had sort of worked its way into the marrow of their bones. You can picture the thin hands of his daughters outstretched towards the struggling fire in the hearth. One night, This uneasy quiet was broken by the shrill screams that heralded the start of the largest witch hunt in American history. 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams threw themselves from their beds and began to writhe on the floor in violent fits of contortions, crying out that they had been bewitched. Rumors caught like wildfire. The devil himself was loose in Salem, and he was actively recruiting citizen after citizen to his diabolical cause, appearing in the guise of a tall gentleman dressed in black from Boston, luring them into the woods, inviting them in dulcet tones to sign away their souls by penning their names in his unhallowed book. This city is notorious. It will live in the shadow of the witch trials forever. And that means it will probably rely on tourism forever. Over the past 3 years, I have met a lot of tourists. I have learned a lot about what people expect from from like a visit to Salem, Massachusetts. There is something wicked, naughty for a lot of people visiting Salem, because there's of course this delicious like specter of devilry hanging around the city's reputation. We are the place to visit for Halloween. We are the place to take a ghost tour. And Colin Dickey in Ghostland again puts what I want to say really neatly. He talks about ghost tours saying, well, he says, ghost tours are popular with tourists, explains geographer Glenn Gentry, because they allow access to dissonant knowledge, dirty laundry, this idea of backstage. They are the celebrity gossip of history, the salacious underbelly of the past, and we're drawn to them because the standard history often obscures as much as it reveals. So there you have it. I don't know if I could give a tour as many nights a week as I did, of course, pre-pandemic, if it wasn't a ghost tour. I find this work rewarding because of the kind of tourist that takes the ghost tour. They want to hear what people assume museums won't tell them, and I hope that's why you're here. Now, I said, if you want to fully appreciate the hauntings here, just to get like the proper context for them, I firmly believe that you have to understand, or at least have a sense of the history. As I mentioned, like Witch Trials 101. And if we are going to get into the history of witch hysteria, we have got to start where any discussion about Salem's history should start, in my opinion, and that is by acknowledging that this city stands on the traditional lands of the Massachusetts tribe, and that the true name of this area is Namkiag, meaning fishing place. 400 years ago, what is now known as the city of Salem was a heavily forested area. It was a rich, stable ecosystem of local plants and animals, and the people of the Massachusetts tribe who lived here are definitely to be credited with establishing the first known maritime trade, commerce, paths, road systems, agriculture, architecture here. The use of this space by others is the result of forced displacement of the land's original owners. In 1626, European colonizers arrived and occupied it, establishing a settlement that they called Salem. By the late 1600s, Salem's population was almost entirely Puritan. The quick and dirty that you need to know about the Puritans, I think, is that they were the sort of people who didn't think that the Church of England in the late 1600s was strict enough. They are separatists. They are extremists. At the core of their belief was a judgmental God that punished evil severely. This notion of total depravity, that humankind is completely evil through the fall of Adam and Eve and is therefore damned for eternity, and the idea of predestination, this idea that salvation or damnation was already predetermined by God before you were born. It was a very hopeless state of affairs. And these folks had a very visceral fear of Satan. They believed that on a good day, the devil and his forces were quite literally walking amongst their community, trying to tempt the good and the God-fearing. They feared witches in this very real sense. And on my tours, I always like to compare it to our fear of serial killers, actually, if you can think about it sort of like that, in that they believed in magic in a way that they thought it was totally possible, that we would find utterly impossible today, even if you are an actual practitioner of the craft. They had protocols for dealing with witchcraft written into their laws. They believed that witches were an active threat to the community. They thought that they were dealing with an infestation here in the late 1600s. And unfortunately, let's see. No, that's not what I want to say. I'm going to go on. Now, today, the city of Salem is very proud to be nicknamed Witch City. I love us for it. I moved here for it. We have taken the liberty in this town of like slapping a witch on everything you could possibly slap a witch on. And this is down to taxi cabs. And if you can believe it or not, as complicated as this is, police badges. It's Witch City is officially in the title of our city. It's like the mayor's all about it, etc. But this feeds into the largest misconception about what actually happened here. There were, in fact, no witches harmed in the making of the Salem witch trials. It is safe to say there was not a single active like practitioner here in the 1600s. So no witches at the witch trials. What actually occurred? We lost 20 and then some innocent people to pure fear-mongering. Anybody accused, anybody executed, anybody who cried guilty for very complicated legal reasons, they were very likely not performing what the witches would have, what the Puritans, excuse me, would have considered witchcraft. They certainly were not trying to harm anyone. We have a historic tragedy on our hands here, made all the more tragic because this witch hunt started, of course, like all 17th century witch hunts. In any given community where this sort of panic broke out, who were the first to be accused? Across the board, it's the outcasts. It's the folks pushed to the fringes of society, the most vulnerable, marginalized, disenfranchised citizens in town. Witch hunts were very convenient vehicles by which quietly hateful communities could cleanse themselves. And I mean, of course, that word in the ugliest way I can possibly mean it. The Puritans believed that Satan would select the, and I hate this as well, quote unquote, weakest individuals. So think women, children, the elderly, to carry out his work. This was the kindling for the Salem witch trials. The young girls of the Reverend's household first accused the woman who looked after them. This was Tituba. She was an enslaved person who had been brought to Salem from Barbados by Reverend Paris. She was one of the only people of color in the entire community at the time. The girls' prejudices sadly made Tituba the easiest target. Of course, she was going to be the first in the community to be accused. Now, there is an elephant of a question in the room. I get asked it almost every single work night. And these days I always address it very early in my tours because if I don't, it just like sometimes gnaws at people. And it's the question historians have been trying to answer for 300 years. It's quite simply, why? Why did Elizabeth and Abigail start screaming and convulsing and inventing these lies? I have my theory, and you're going to have to form yours. It's anybody's guess, but there are a few things we know that it wasn't. And it wasn't because of any physical ailment or illness. A lot of people look for a physical explanation. This is quite natural, I think, maybe because it makes this whole mess a little bit easier to swallow, if at all possible. This pervasive theory caught on several years back, and it was very interesting. It was about ergot, a particular fungus in rye, which the Puritans at the time were eating a lot of. And the swampy conditions here in Salem, we are like situated right in the heart of a swamp. Isn't that cute? The conditions were perfect for this mold to thrive. So when ingested, among other things, ergot is known to induce hallucinations and convulsions, again, among other things. So historians posited that the Puritan girls were eating this bad rye, seeing visions and trembling because of this poisoning. But there are actually a lot more symptoms involved in ergot poisoning, including vomiting, diarrhea, livid skin, etc. I'm not going to go any further than that. All physicians' records that we have, they indicate that the girls in question were in perfectly good health, aside from the bewitchment. And we know now more about the nature of ergot hallucinations, and they're actually more perceptual distortions, like spatial, than they are visions of specific people or things that are not there. The girls, of course, were claiming to see their neighbors looming over their beds to torment them, and to see witches' familiars in the shapes of birds, dogs, snakes coming to creep to them in the night. Another argument against the case for ergot poisoning is that the symptoms only appeared in these girls when the whole only appeared in these girls, I should say, when the whole community was also consuming the rye. And conveniently, these symptoms did not continue beyond the end of the trials after sort of 1693 rolled around. So again, why? In my opinion, to answer this, we have to take on the unpleasant task of imagining life as a young Puritan girl. It was isolating, it was demeaning, it was oppressive. Puritan children had no toys to play with. Girls were expected to work their father's land. They had no agency over their futures. And what's more, Puritan culture was all about temperance. I think that's actually a cheap word for it. It was more about restraint, the repression of intense emotions. To be overcome with sadness or happiness or anger or anything was seen as unfortunately and profanely worldly, as opposed to godly. So being crushed by those circumstances might make someone want to scream. And we know that children can't articulate their distress sometimes, so they act out. But acting out in these specific ways that would indicate bewitchment, unfortunately and conveniently, a lot of ministers in Boston were very passionate about publishing pamphlets warning against bewitchment. So this was part of the cultural narrative. The girls would have known what a bewitchment would technically look like if it were to happen. And they sort of behaved to the letter of a lot of these pamphlets. Now imagine you are acting out. You're a young Puritan girl who has never been listened to in her life, and now the most powerful men in your community hand you the mic. Ask your opinion. It is a lot of power all of a sudden, and it is really complicated if you try to back out of your lie, your game. It's dangerous. Unfortunately, the girls turned on, as I mentioned, the most vulnerable women in their community first, and from there, things spiraled out of control. That is my 2 cents. And that is Witch Trials 101. And I think we're ready for some ghosts. So I'm going to show you a very spooky place, if I can screen share effectively. Are you ready? Let's see. Almost. Success. No. No. There we go. Okay. So, this is the only site from my route that I want to cover, because today there's some places that I can't access during my tours that I never get to talk about that I really want to talk about. But this is one from my route. Salem has so much gorgeous architecture to offer, but the prettiest places aren't necessarily the most paranormally active. Here in the center of downtown, overseeing which city mall parking lot, oh boy, there's this very unexciting office building. This, however, would have been the very last place that you would want to find yourself in 1692. 10 Federal Street is where the jail stood during the trials. It was erected in 1683, looked a lot different than this. It was crafted with hand-hewn oak. It measured about 70 by 280 feet. Conditions were squalid. The jail was a small room with a low ceiling and coffin cells around the perimeter. And a record was kept of every single item used by the prisoners, down to the shackles that held them. When someone was released, they would have to pay for all of that. And if someone was executed, their family would be charged the fines. As I mentioned coffin cells. That is where the poorest prisoners would be lodged. A coffin cell would see you in a standing cell no larger than a standing coffin, hence the name. So prisoners could not lie down. They could barely sit. When the North River flooded, it would seep into the jail. Prisoners would be up to their ankles in swamp water. As you can imagine, inside a coffin cell, it got psychologically crushing. But no one was looking forward to the moment when a key would turn in the lock in their coffin cell, because that meant it was time to be interrogated by Sheriff George Corwin, our sheriff during the trials, who was such a notoriously vicious officer. He was actually nicknamed the Strangler because of his penchant for choking the quote unquote truth out of those that he questioned. During his interrogations, he favored two techniques in particular. This is at least what's on record most often. It appears to be hoop tying and thumb screws. And I always stop my tour here for a quick note. This next history in particular, I don't seek to sensationalize at all. I think that would be fundamentally irresponsible of me as a guide, because we have got to reckon with the fact that this is absolutely inhumane torture that took place. So I'm not going to get graphic with the details. I'm just going to give you bare bones. We're going to start with hoop tying. There were rafters in the dungeons. There were rigs hanging from them, and on those rigs would have been suspended a large metal hoop, hence the name. A prisoner would be strapped to that in an excruciating position, usually hog-tied. So this means sort of like from neck to heels, bent backwards, if you can imagine. They would be left to hang there for sometimes hours, sometimes days, while the sheriff himself elicited confessions from them by whatever means he deemed necessary. But Corwin was most infamous for his use of the thumb screws. This is a smaller device, arguably a more intimate form of torture, because as he was asking his questions, he would employ the thumb screws to slowly twist and break the hands and fingers of whoever he was interrogating. Now, this next fact is not a fun one either. But if we're talking about the paranormal activity here at 10 Federal Street, we've got to talk about the youngest prisoner kept in Corwin's dungeons during the trials. Her name was Dorcas Good. She was 4 years old. She was so small, the local blacksmith actually had to fashion custom shackles to accommodate her tiny wrists. What could a 4-year-old possibly have done to warrant an arrest? This is unfortunately the Puritans were dealing with. They believed that witchcraft ran in families, because of course they did. So her mother was accused before her. Sarah Good was one of the first 3 women accused. Dorcas was later considered guilty essentially by association. The two of them had been homeless before Sarah was incarcerated. When Sarah was incarcerated, that left a 4-year-old girl alone on the streets to fend for herself. Her mother had been her everything. When Dorcas was brought before the court of Oyer and Terminer, she must have put 2 and 2 together in her 4-year-old mind, thought something along the lines of, if I say I am a witch, maybe I will go and be taken wherever they have taken my mom. She was right. The two of them were reunited underground in Corwin's dungeons, where they spent 3 months together in adjoining coffin cells, after which Sarah was rushed away and promptly executed, leaving Dorcas alone for a remaining 5 months to grieve. That's a total of 8 months for a 4-year-old in those conditions, tended to by that sheriff. So when the trials were over, the pardons come rolling in, Dorcas was freed, but unfortunately, she was never the same. She wandered for the rest of her brief life like her mother had, significantly distraught, however, and she died alone on the streets around the age of 15. It is her ghost that is said to haunt the area around what was the old jail. And when I first heard that on like night 1 of my training, I made the wrong assumption about this haunting. I thought mistakenly Dorcas Good must be one of the most righteously vengeful poltergeists that Salem, Massachusetts has to offer, because I thought if anyone deserves to be raising a bit of hell, it is this young girl. Yes, but I could not have been more wrong. This haunting is actually profoundly gentle. Either way, gentle or not, I still would have found it particularly heartbreaking. But the activity tends to happen between the hours of midnight and 2 a.m. when all the ghostly good stuff seems to occur. And this haunting usually, if not always, involves a local, because we are very dramatic. We love our long coats and cloaks and skirts. We really love to swish. Floor length attire is critical to this paranormal activity. And this is the most consistent report that sort of home base of my company that I work for gets all the time. The story is always the same. Someone will be walking past this office building through one of the parking lots alone, quite late at night, in their, of course, floor-length outfit, until they feel a very distinct, very disconcerting yank down at the back of their attire. So of course you're going to turn around, try to see who or what on earth is trying to get your attention. Thank God for cowards like yours truly. Nothing ever manifests, no horrors await, but that is not a party I want to be invited to, feeling a tug, turning and finding I'm still alone in a parking lot. That is not my cup of tea, but paranormal enthusiasts have connected the dots quite easily here. It is very likely the restless spirit of young 4-year-old Dorcas looking for comfort in the one place where she would have known to find it over the course of her life, and that was naturally at the hem of mother's skirt. We're going to move on. How's that for an icebreaker, Ghostwise? To somewhere I'm definitely not allowed to stop on my tours because cemeteries are closed at night. So I am thrilled to tell you about this. This is Howard Street Cemetery. It is just a short, like hop, skip, and a jump from 10 Federal Street. It's off the main drag. It is lurking behind a charming Polish Catholic church, and it's watched over by a sleepy row of suburban houses. During the trials, this would have been an open field, if you can picture it. And at this angle, you would have sort of been seeing all the way down to the North River through the mist. This is a hidden gem. It's really unassuming, and it is home to Salem's most vicious poltergeist. There were 20 people formally executed during the hysteria. 19 were hanged, Giles Corey being the exception. He was pressed to death. His execution was carried out here, and it is likely that his remains are some of the nameless among the dead at Howard Street Cemetery. He was 80 years old when the trials came about, and by then he had made a lot of enemies in town. I want to make this clear because Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, paints Giles Corey with a really gentle brush. He was really ill-tempered. Giles was a classic, if not the original, hey, get off my lawn, you kids guy. And this is a puritanical get off my lawn, you kids guy. It's a completely different animal. By this, I mean, unfortunately, for example, he had been taken to court years before the witch trials for beating one of his servants to death with a stick. This is the man who ends up going toe to toe with our sadistic 26-year-old sheriff. And Giles noticed there was something going on with the money as the trials rolled along. And there's always something going on with the money. What happened to your fortune after you're formally tried and executed for witchcraft? You lost the privilege of giving anything to your descendants. Instead, all of your assets were seized by Sheriff George Corwin, and he got to decide how to divvy up that money. His judgment was usually thus: 2/3 for me and the boys, and 1/3 for the person who accused the witch. He incentivized accusations. And this is why accusations start climbing the social ladder. Now, as I said, Giles did not have a lot of friends. He knew that his enemies would be seeking to accuse him to ruin his family. And Giles was a farmer. He didn't have much, but he saw what the sheriff was doing, and he was determined that Corwin would not see a cent of his property. He was proud and he was clever, and he found a loophole in the Puritan legal system, and he slipped through it at great cost. You had a sort of hearing before you had a formal trial, and at that hearing, it was expected that you would plead, of course, either innocent or guilty. What happens in 1692 if you just don't plead one way or the other at all? You couldn't have a formal trial. You couldn't be formally executed. The sheriff couldn't formally seize all of your assets. But of course, the sheriff wanted to move things along. He wanted the money to keep flowing, and he wanted to make an example of Corey so other people didn't try what he did. So he resolved to make Corey plead. one way or the other. And he resurrected a form of medieval torture that had not been seen in America until then, September 19th of the year 1692. This was a really public affair. It was a calculated display of the sheriff's brutality. And 100 of Salem's citizens came to bear witness as the sheriff's men dragged Giles Corey from the jail. Again, that's 10 Federal Street. That's just sort of to the left of the photo that you guys are seeing. They dragged him to where Howard Street Cemetery now sits, into this open field. They stripped the old man naked. They sat him down on his back in a shallow ditch and placed a wooden board on top of him. And on top of that, they lowered, at first, for starters, a 20-pound boulder right over his chest. Under these circumstances, in front of the crowd, the sheriff asked Corey the question that he had been asked over and over and over during this hearing, which was, of course, quite famously, "Are you innocent or guilty of the crime of witchcraft?" To which Giles replied quite simply, "More weight." And they lent it to him, unfortunately. They stacked stone after stone on top of him, one for each time the question was put to him and each time that he gave the same answer. It took 3 excruciating days before he was finally crushed to death. And legend says that he did manage to say one last thing before he died. And it's classic. "I curse you, sheriff, and all of Salem." If you're going to go out, go with a bang. Yes. In this work, it's really, really weird, even for skeptics. The curse worked. And Drunk History on Comedy Central does a fantastic episode on this. So if you're curious about this, definitely it's worth a look on YouTube. It's absolutely ridiculous. They'll do a better job explaining than I ever could. But what happened to the sheriff after being allegedly cursed by Giles Corey? He died quite simply 3 years after the trials of a really specific blood disease and heart condition that was pretty standard, but it was chronicled in physicians' notes. That's not extraordinary to me. What is extraordinary is that every single sheriff who took up the job here in Salem after George Corwin has died of pretty much that exact same blood disease and heart condition, definitely heart complications. It was absolutely consistent. One particular sheriff in the 70s was especially curious about this, and he did sort of the full breadth of research and found that it was completely consistent. We did manage to break the curse, though, in the 90s, it seems. So this is no longer happening today. When the office of the sheriff, like the physical office, was moved to Middleton, the curse has sort of traveled since then. It doesn't necessarily affect the sheriff themselves, but strangely, it still might affect a member of their immediate family. But Giles Corey cursed Salem in general, as well as the sheriff, and we definitely did not get off easy. As I mentioned, Howard Street Cemetery is thoroughly haunted, and by the spirit, of course, of Giles Corey. Unfortunately, he doesn't stay in Howard Street Cemetery. This ghost has been seen about a mile out in all directions, but he sort of focuses on the cemetery as a central node. When he appears, if people don't know to be on their guard for him, a lot of people who have seen him don't really think that anything paranormal is occurring at first, because initially he just looks like you or me. He is flesh and blood. There's nothing ghostly about him. He looks like an 80-year-old man in perfect puritanical attire. But folks are quite certain that they are seeing some sort of apparition when allegedly his eyes take on this burning quality. He is the worst omen that you could hope to see in Salem, Massachusetts, and we have a lot of bad ones. But like clockwork, whenever he is seen wandering Howard Street, whenever he's encountered, something horrific happens to this town. And by that, I mean like a natural disaster, strings of murders, significant political unrest. His most famous sighting, it was actually chronicled in the Salem newspaper in 1914. He was wandering night after night to the point where he actually drew crowds to Howard Street Cemetery, and the police actually had to set up a presence to get people to go away because they were too curious. And just after sort of that activity, the Great Fire of 1914 broke out. It swept through most of downtown and took the jail from us, Bridget Bishop's property, all of these things heavily associated with the trials. Last haunted site. This is a brief one. And then I'm gonna, things will get a little interesting. This is the Merchant, and it's officially called the Joshua Ward House. It's a boutique hotel right in the heart of downtown Salem. So this is a little ways away from Howard Street and 10 Federal. It's really, really quaint and charming inside. Unfortunately, it stands precisely on the frame of the foundations of what was Sheriff Corwin's house. And this is a site that's really off of my tour route. And it's definitely not the most popular haunted hotel in Salem. That would definitely be the Hawthorne, but the Merchant is worth talking about, especially in the context of these other two ghost stories. What the sheriff could not get away with in the public dungeon that we discussed, he actually got away with here in the private dungeon that he would have instated underneath this property. There are records of people being taken from the jail and brought here overnight. No real record of what transpired underground, but when they returned to the public jail, it is always noted that they are quite changed. The hauntings here are really hush-hush. And the first two sort of indications that there's activity, it's nothing terribly spectacular, or more importantly to me, nothing that really indicates that it's absolutely the presence of the sheriff that is still here. People say that taper candles tend to bend in strange directions. Skeptics, of course, are going to take a look at that and say that at the Merchant, perhaps the heat is on too high, that sort of thing. A stranger occurrence that's pretty incredible paranormal activity, but again, doesn't tell me that it's absolutely the sheriff. When people walk into their rooms here at the Merchant sometimes, before they can turn on the light, they may see the silhouette of a gentleman in the armchair that's allotted to their room. When they flick on the light, no one is there. Again, unsettling, but do we know it's the sheriff? The element here at play at the Merchant that chills me to the bone, and definitely I went inside, but I was very hesitant to do so, given what I know. Especially folks who struggle with sleep paralysis, just quite generally, may have a really uneasy night's sleep. A lot of people are prone to fits of sleep paralysis here at the Merchant, but it's a little bit different than their usual sort of symptoms. It's quite distinct. People will wake in the night and they can move their limbs just fine, but they report feeling this iron pressure on their throat, sort of pinning them to the bed, specifically on their neck. And as we know about Corwin, he was most infamously nicknamed the Strangler. It is very likely that this site, even though this is, again, the Joshua Ward house, the actual house is burned down, the site still sort of feels his hand in a sense. So that's it in terms of official ghost stories. But let's see, finishing up here. I want to finish actually, because I've never really had the right platform to talk about what is, I think, the most interesting part of a ghost tour. For me, that is the 20 minutes just after a ghost tour. I always finish at Salem's most haunted mansion. I close the tour officially and I wait under this really stark street light in front of this massive wrought iron gate for people to collect my card if they want to review me or ask for directions or to ask questions that maybe I didn't cover. It's usually about 9:30, and Salem is a sleepy town most of the year. So Essex Street, which is really lively during the day, is a different animal. It's quiet enough for like the occasional stray cat to cross. That's when people get very interesting. And that's when my job gets a little intense. That's when a few things tend to happen. And it varies from night to night which, but it's always one of these. One, that's when people tiptoe up to me and, of course, ask the questions that they didn't think that they could ask during the tour in front of the group. Sometimes those are questions people might feel are too historically simple, that they just didn't get clarified at the museums. But sometimes people challenge me, like, how do you really know about that particular haunting, etc. Sometimes people get very personal, like, am I a witch? Am I religious? How can I talk about all these sad things every night and be okay? I also often get a lot of people, and I will be honest with you, the majority of them are women from the South with these wonderful drawling accents. They very kindly ask me to explain what I mean by actual practitioners when I referenced people actually doing witchcraft, or asking what kind of magic is really done. They are fascinated, genuinely, but maybe they're too intimidated to go into some of the occult shops and esoteric shops. So yes, folks ask questions, the hard questions, the real questions that like count, that they've probably been holding on to the entire tour, maybe the entire day during their visit. Or two, I have people who come up to me and sort of state a reaction to what they just heard. Like, oh my God, that was terrible. I can't believe all of this tragedy because people were so hateful. It's so eerie how all of this is sort of still happening today. Some people need this follow-up. And that makes a lot of sense. They want to process with me after this long stint of being confronted with all of this heavy material. And a lot of the time, these folks are the ones who at some point over the course of this exchange tell me, I didn't know the depths of the horror of it all. Like, I knew it was bad, but oh my God, a 4-year-old girl in the name of religion, et cetera, et cetera. And third, sometimes people, of course, and these people either rush up to me or they hang back for a really long time. When they get me alone, they are so eager to unload about a paranormal experience that they had. Usually it's about another place they visited, where something extraordinary happened on a tour, or it's about a haunted house they lived in when they were young, and a whole family will like stand by this account. And sometimes it gets very, very personal, very, very quickly. And people tell me these intimate accounts of, for example, seeing their recently dead grandmother in their dreams. I definitely feel like, as a ghost tour guide specifically, I am in a unique position, a unique role. And before I started doing this work, I never really bothered to imagine this would be part of my job every night. I become this opportunity to engage with the taboo, and very important taboo, things that people never get into, say at, of course, like the family holiday party or even with their friends. It's morbid things that are very important, that are heavy on people's hearts. Like, the stage is set. I've been tackling uncomfortable historical truths head on, been vocally very open-minded about the paranormal for a solid hour and a half. I've been making this space safe. And all of a sudden, we are in the perfect golden moment where we get to talk about ghosts. And when we talk about ghosts, it's a moment to engage with fear and mystery and shame and grief and anger about our history, and to engage with death. We are encountering like the bread and butter of what we consider the Gothic. Yes, things that aren't usually on the table, as it were. There we are, alone on a cold, still street. We are face to face, no technology between us. And I'm relatively anonymous. And more importantly, so are you, because I'm going to disappear into the night and I won't remember your name. And there's a magic in that. And I think this moment sneaks up on people, especially people who don't have an outlet for these kinds of conversations, people who don't attend Gothic lectures on the weekend for fun, for example. So I know people may not realize what they're asking of me. Some nights it's really hard, but some nights the conversations are extraordinary. Salem, and specifically Salem's ghosts, work on people. They provoke this kind of discussion. They demand to be reckoned with. Why I like the book Ghostland so much is because it put into words what I was seeing on my route every day. Cullen Dickey asserts that we, specifically in the United States, need ghosts to process history. What we did, human being to human being, in 1692 is so horrific. It is like incomputable. And when you visit the city, when you can suddenly walk into one of the judge's houses and touch his dining room table, and you can feel what we have done to one another, like breathing down your neck, and it's closer than you thought. It manifests, it's real, it happened. We did this to one another. We're capable of the Salem witch trials. When you're here walking these streets, you get this clear view of the scar that we bear in our collective consciousness. What happened here will haunt us forever. Of course, we assume the restless spirits from that notorious year will never be able to sleep. The ghost stories we are telling are reflections of us, what we need to say, but sometimes don't know how to say. Dorcas Good's spirit is still looking for comfort about this. So are we. Giles Corey's spirit is still furious about these injustices. So are we. And George Corwin's spirit is still present. It is still a threat. It hasn't learned, and neither have we. Sheriff Corwin was not a singular event or even a rare event in American history or in the present. He is still happening. Salem requires these ghosts to process the witch trials. Now, to tie things up, and then I'll open for more questions, but I'm going to answer the question that every tour guide has to answer before the end of a tour. This is Ghost Tour Law, forever and ever, amen. Have you ever seen anything? No, I personally have not. I will be retiring the day that I do. That is not about to happen anytime soon, though, because I'm about as paranormally sensitive as a ham sandwich. I do not see ghosts. I don't feel their presence. This is great for the kind of work I do because I can do this kind of work every day. Like, some of my colleagues are practicing mediums, and it's a whole other ballgame for them. This said, plenty of weird stuff has happened on the job regarding other people seeing things when they're sort of out on the route with me. When the whole tour jumps at something like at once that's behind you, it's exactly like seeing a cat get really focused on something in a corner of the room when there's nothing there. It's absolutely horrible. And that happens a lot on the tour, especially at the Gardner Pingree house, my last stop of all stops. There's one particular window where a ghost is said to appear. And so everyone's always like trained on it. Oh man, it's like every few nights over the course of a year, or like once in a blue moon, rather, over the course of a year, the thick curtain in that window will flutter, I guess, and it's enough to shock like the 50 people. And I always almost have a heart attack. We can call it maybe the air conditioning in that room, but it's very, very scary no matter what. Then the other strange thing that happened to me, I had a 20-something guy from New Jersey who looks exactly like however you're picturing him right now. I guarantee it. I will never forget him. He showed me a photograph that he was like taking selfies at every single site. And he took one, and I was in the background of it. And there was a window behind me. And he never sent it to me. I was so frustrated because it was this horrifying photo of what looked like in Salem's Most Haunted Restaurant, one of the windows. It was like a Gibson girl, perfect hair, perfect dress, just behind me in the window. And I was shaking like a chihuahua at the vet for the rest of the tour, but it was very cool. Lastly, one of the weirdest phone calls I've ever gotten in my life was mid-tour, and my manager called me, which was absolutely strange. She was alone, out training 2 new guides, and I was taking the main group around. She called me distraught, and wanted to warn me near Howard Street Cemetery for the first time. She had crossed paths with an elderly man in perfect puritanical attire. She had never seen him in town, and she had never seen him again. She's really level about these things. She's been doing this long enough to get sort of desensitized, but she called me in an absolute panic. And I am not going to lie, I was definitely looking over my shoulder the entire tour. Now I'm going to take the floor. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I'm also going to throw up some of my resources that I use, my favorite books. I will say, if you're interested in more reading, and I'll put this up for you, I love this book called A Delusion of Satan by Francis Hill. If you're looking for further reading that's really accessible, sort of a quick read that gets in depth about witchcraft and what happened here, I'm going to put that title up for you. I also really stand by the horror film, The Witch, A New England Folktale. It's pretty spot on for the puritanical idea of a witch. And there's a page of resources, and I'm going to put this link up in just a sec, by Native Voices that the Witch House, a historic site here in town, has compiled if you want to learn more about the Massachusetts tribe and their history here, especially in the 1600s. So that's that, and I'll try to attempt to get this link up for you, but I'll welcome any questions you guys have.
Thank you so much.